Hope everyone's doing well. We're here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania this afternoon. It's kind of a cold and gray and gloomy Sunday afternoon. Very, very similar to what we see in Michigan. Although I guess in Pennsylvania it's maybe 5-10 degrees warmer. So the spring starts a little bit earlier. You know, you got all your dogwood trees starting to bloom already, which again we don't have in Michigan until another couple weeks later in the spring. And so we're overdue for a 30,000 mile update on our 2021 F-150 PowerBoost Hybrid, which we've owned for about 13 months. And the bottom line on this truck is that it is continuing to plug away and do great things for us on a constant basis. We've taken this trip across the country and back. We've taken this trip down to South Carolina and back, all over the Midwest, all over the Northeast. And it has done everything we've asked it to do. It has never once left us stranded or never once made us go to the dealer to have anything fixed. It has not needed any maintenance other than oil and filter changes and tire rotations. And the oil and filter changes are pretty obvious. You need that with every vehicle you drive. The tire rotations you have to do religiously on this truck because the outer edges of the front tires tend to wear prematurely. And so it's just unfortunate, but that's the way it was with our 97 F-150, and that's the way it is with this one. You gotta rotate those tires religiously, or you'll wear them down to the belts on the edges before you know it, and then you'll have to get 4 new tires. And so it makes sense that we're here actually in Bethlehem. We're here for, I don't know, about a week, taking care of a few things. That's the old headquarters of Bethlehem Steel there. And these are the old blast furnaces. And these things used to run 24/7 for months and years and decades back when the company was operating. And they finally shut down in 1995. And it was kind of tragic because these blast furnaces, these were the source of all of the molten iron, pig iron, that turned into steel, that built 85% of the skyscrapers in New York City, built the Golden Gate Bridge, built the Empire, not the Empire State Building, Madison Square Garden, the Newport Bridge in Rhode Island, the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River in New York City. 1 ship per day during World War II. And all kinds of other structural steel and munitions and aircraft and tanks that helped us win the Second World War and help build this country over the last 100+ years. And it all started here in these blast furnaces. And the way a blast furnace works, if you're not familiar with them, is it's basically almost like a chimenea from your backyard. And you may not be able to see it, but there are little tracks. And those tracks have little hoppers that go up and down. And they are constantly bringing iron ore, which typically came from Minnesota or up in Canada, and limestone, which could come from all over the place, and refined coal, metallurgical coal, otherwise known as coke, which came from, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, parts of Virginia. And they would dump it in the top, and then they would blast in high pressure, high temperature air into about a dozen entry points toward the base of the furnace, 1600 degree high pressure air, and that air would initiate and sustain a combustion process that was essentially continuous and permanent and never stopped. And every so often, out of the bottom of the furnaces, when they would tap them, they would take out high temperature molten iron. And those were the two products of those blast furnaces, iron and slag. And they would generate about 3,000 tons a day of molten iron. And then that would get loaded up into rail cars, or hoppers on rail cars, and then transported further down the river, which is to the east, to elsewhere in the Bethlehem Steel complex. And so the company was started in the year 1860 for the purpose of making rails for a guy who owned a railroad. And it was a convenient location because it was essentially the junction of the Lehigh River and the Penn North Railroad. And so the rails that came out of here, when it was the Bethlehem Iron Company, could easily get transported all over the country. And obviously, the timing was perfect because the Civil War started right after the company was founded. And so they got a lot of business as a result of that. And then 20 years later, they started making steel in addition to just iron in 1880. In 1901, a guy named Charles Schwab bought the company. And then a few years later, he took a big gamble by purchasing the patent for something called a wide flange beam, the process that created them. And it's where you take a large rectangular shaped beam of steel out of the furnaces, and you send it through a series of rollers oriented horizontally and vertically, back and forth until it goes from being square shaped to being eye shaped. And that was the modern I-beam, otherwise known as the Bethlehem beam. And once they perfected that process, essentially it was off to the races, and they built the New York City skyline. They built the Golden Gate Bridge, again, Rockefeller Center, 85% of the skyscrapers in New York City, and really around the rest of the country. And then during World War II, during World War I, 40% of the cannons and the munitions came from Bethlehem Steel. During World War II, the vast majority of the ships in the U.S. Navy came from Bethlehem Steel, which was also a shipbuilder in addition to being a steel company. And they were tremendously successful and profitable. After World War II, for about 15 years, they really had no competition because Japan and Germany had been bombed to rubble, and something like 89% of the productive capacity of the entire free world was in the U.S. And Bethlehem Steel was the number 2 steel company in the country. And so they did very well for quite a long time. Like I said, about that 15-year stretch. And then unfortunately, the company fell on hard times, and there was a big strike in 1959, and what became the United Steelworkers not only shut down Bethlehem Steel, but they also shut down U.S. Steel and really the rest of the U.S., the American steel industry. And it got so bad that the vice president, who was Richard Nixon, had to step in and negotiate the settlement and the agreement. And what came out of it was a very generous labor agreement with the steel workers. And in fairness, they had a very tough job, an exceptionally difficult and dangerous job. And so the agreement, some would say it finally rewarded or compensated them fairly for the very, very tough job they were doing. But it also raised the cost of doing business substantially for all of the American steel companies. And so they had to raise their prices to remain profitable. And then they got in trouble for price fixing, which may or may not have actually been the case. And so simultaneously, while the cost was going up, the cost of doing business, and not just the cost for the workers who were on the job, but eventually it got to the point where there were 5 retirees for every 1 steel worker who was on the job, and that became unsustainable. At the very same time, the Japanese, the Asian, and European steel industries were making a comeback, and they had gotten back on their feet after World War II, and because they had essentially a clean slate, they were more technologically advanced than a company like Bethlehem Steel, which didn't really take a lot of time and effort to modernize itself. It did not reinvest the profits in improving the company. It paid the profits out to the shareholders and to the management, which was very, very well compensated. And additionally, there were these things called mini mills, which were starting to show up. And a mini mill only cost a couple $100 million to put into operation, compared to, the more larger facilities like Bethlehem and US Steel, which cost, $1 billion or more to put up. And those recycled old scrap steel, and they used a process called continuous casting, and so Bethlehem wasn't really staying current with the times and reinvesting in new technology. And so they had price pressure from imported steel, and they had cost pressure because of their labor agreements. And so it just all added up to become unsustainable. And you knew the gig was up. They knew it in the late 60s when the World Trade Center project was awarded not to US Steel, not to Bethlehem Steel, which was the lowest bidder, but instead the Port Authority of New York said, we're not giving it to either one of you. We're giving it to a series of contractors who will use imported steel. And so the Twin Towers in New York City were not built with American steel. They were built with imported, low-cost steel, which is kind of a little-known fact. And so the industry just fell in hard times, and it never really got better. The 70s were terrible. In 82, there were massive amounts of layoffs, as immortalized in the song Allentown by Billy Joel, which you'll remember if you were alive in the 70s or 80s. And, the company was just kind of in a death spiral at that point. It tried to improve. It tried to innovate. And really, as hard as they tried, they just couldn't get past the fact that they had such high legacy costs. The EPA started coming down on them. They had to put all kinds of emissions controls in the blast furnaces and everywhere else in the company. And if you can imagine this gigantic furnace that burns thousands of tons of coal every week, that was a difficult thing to do. And so the company ended up declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy just after 9/11. The blast furnaces here shut down in 95, but the company had a number of other facilities. Sparrows Point in Maryland, very, very big steel plant, the largest steel plant in the free world. Lackawanna, New York. They had one in on the northern coast of Indiana to supply the auto industry. And after 9/11, they declared bankruptcy, and then in February of 2003, they liquidated. And that was the end. After 100 plus years, almost 150 years, one of the greatest and largest industrial companies the U.S. has ever seen cease to exist. And so why are we talking about that? Well, because this F-150, the PowerBoost, represents a very, very large gamble that Ford took on the future of pickup trucks. You all know that the F-Series pickup has been the best-selling vehicle of any kind in the U.S. for many, many years. It's extremely profitable for Ford. It's not just a volume leader, but it's also a money printing machine for Ford. And they know, because they're not stupid, that all good things must come to an end eventually. And you are never so big that you are immune to the threat of being shut down and put out of business. And so they're taking steps to not just try to adjust to the future, but to try to own the future. And so the Ford PowerBoost represents, again, a very bold step, something of a risk. And they weren't sure how it would be received. But because they'd done their homework, they've done a great job with this truck. It was very well received. And not only does it have good EPA numbers, less so in reality, it's got great towing numbers. It's got tremendous power and torque, 430 horsepower, 570 pounds of torque. It's got strong towing numbers. And it's got this thing called Pro Power on board, which is high output AC power. And to be honest, everything about this truck works as advertised, except for the MPGs. You are not going to get 24 highway and 24 city unless you're driving it like your grandmother, like your 90-year-old grandmother. The problem is that it's almost a victim of itself because it generates so much power so easily. You never really have to get into it too deep into the throttle, because the twin turbos generate huge amounts of boost starting at low RPMs. You don't even really have to rev it over 2,500 RPMs to make all the power that you need. And so as a result, because it's so strong, you wind up driving it harder than you realize you're driving it. And anytime it's in the boost, it's burning huge amounts of fuel. Partly to make the power that you're demanding of it, and partly because of the fact that they like to run it very, very rich under boost in order to keep the exhaust gas temperatures, the EGTs, down, so it doesn't kill the turbochargers. And so in day-to-day driving, you see we're at 20 miles to the gallon. I'm sorry, 21 miles to the gallon. That's about what you're going to get in the highway, in the city or on the highway. It's just not going to get 24, and you need to put that out of your minds. In 13 months of owning it and 30,000+ miles, we have only once come close to the EPA number, and that was during a long, slow stretch of driving from like San Diego to LA at like between 55 and 65 miles an hour. But that's not typical. Most of the time you're going between 70 and 80 miles an hour on the highway. And when you're going what I consider typical Midwestern highway speeds, yeah, you're going to get between about 18 and maybe 21 MPGs. And so you just need to get that EPA number out of your head. Unfortunately, a lot of people fell for it, and they bought this thing instead of the diesel. And in reality, the diesel, the 3.0 Power Stroke, is a better engine if you do substantial amounts of towing. Partly because of the durability, the inherent durability of a diesel engine, because of how heavily built it is. A diesel can easily last you 500,000 miles if you treat it well. A gas engine, especially a twin turbocharged gas engine like this one, I would be hesitant to keep this thing more than 150,000 miles, to be honest. But everybody saw the EPA numbers of the PowerBoost, and they said, to hell with that diesel, we're getting the PowerBoost. And they learned the hard way that this thing does not get 24 city and 24 highway. And when you hitch up a trailer to it, you're going to get, well, our experience is between 8 and 10 miles to the gallon. with a trailer on the highway. And that's because of the tremendous amount of aerodynamic drag that it adds, and which creates huge demands on the engine. And when the engine is under load, it's going to be burning tons of gas. So we don't mind, because we did not buy it to save gas. We bought it for all the other capabilities it has. Really, mostly because of the high output Pro power on board, which is a series of AC outlets around the vehicle. One in the dashboard here, one in the back seat, and then you got 4 120 outlets in the bed of the truck, and you've also got a 240 outlet, what's called a dryer outlet, a 30 amp 240 volt dryer outlet in the bed of the truck. And it can run your house, it can run your RV, it can run your job site, pretty much anything you need it to. And so that's really why I bought this truck. And when used for that purpose, we've got no issues at all with it. We have not had to take it into the dealer, again, other than for the oil changes and for the tire rotations. We haven't had the issue with the drive shaft. Where the insulation hangs down onto the drive shaft and scuffs it up and makes it, puts it in danger of separating and self-destructing on the highway. We haven't had the issue with the screen, where the screen stops working. We haven't had the issue with the inverter, the 7.2 kilowatt solid state inverter, where the inverter stops working. We haven't had a lot of trouble with the transmission. Every now and then it'll shift a little bit less smooth than it should. But to be honest, it does a good job, the 10-speed transmission. It skips a lot of gears. Typically it'll start in first gear and then go straight to third and spend quite a bit of time in third gear. It'll almost feel like it's sort of slipping a clutch, like letting out a clutch, because you'll be picking up speed while the RPMs are staying constant, briefly. And then once it gets up to speed in third gear, typically it'll shift to fifth, and then it'll go 6 all the way through 10th. Unlike the diesel, this truck has extraordinary amounts of power at any road speed, at any engine speed, whether you're on flat ground or whether you're going up steep hills, whether or not you get a trailer hitched up. And so you never have to think about what gear it's in, because it just takes care of it. You'll notice it shuts off a lot while you're driving. And for the most part, that's transparent. It's just doing its thing, and you don't have to think about it. The only time it becomes an issue is when you're going down steep hills and the truck starts to pick up speed and you want to do some engine braking, but the truck doesn't let you because the engine is switched off. And let me show you this here. So when you have it in drive, all 10 gears are available to you. If you get onto these plus and minus buttons and you start hitting the minus button, you can lock out the top 2 or 3 or 4 gears to where you're only using 1st through 6th, or 1st through 7th, 1st through 8th. And that's a little bit more sophisticated than just putting it in manual mode, where you're locked into 1st gear or locked into whatever gear you want it to be. Let's take it out of manual mode. Because when you lock out the top 2 gears, again, it'll be in 1st gear, 5th gear, 6th, whatever, and you're only locking out 9th and 10th. Or maybe 8th, 9th, and 10th. All of which are overdrive. So maybe you'll have it in 7th gear, which is a direct drive, 1-to-1. And that's all, and that's the size it'll shift. And in the diesel, that's an issue, because going uphill, it does not want to downshift. It starts to lug the engine, and so, next thing you know, you're going 65 miles an hour, and it's in top gear. And in the diesel, that's like 1,200 RPM because of how tall the final drive is. And it'll start to lug the engine, but it is not intelligent enough to downshift. And so you have to use those buttons to lock out the top 2 or 3 gears. going up a hill. In the PowerBoost, not an issue because of, again, the tremendous power delivery that this thing has. Much more so than the diesel. And so it's kind of sad that they're getting rid of the diesel because for so many people, anybody who does any substantial amount of towing, like with that 12-foot U-Haul there, we are constantly towing a 12-foot U-Haul. The diesel will get like 18 mpgs with that thing on the highway, and the PowerBoost will get like 8 or 10. And so that's unfortunate. If they had put the hybrid system into the diesel, the 3.0, that would have been an absolutely tremendous powertrain, because you could get a little more power, you could get a little bit better fuel economy, and you could get that that high output AC power, which the PowerBoost has. But Ford saw fit not to do that, and so you're stuck with a gasoline engine. It's not a problem. A couple other things to pass along. Again, after 34 plus thousand miles, again, we're not starting to see any reliability issues. We don't have the issue of the transmission, shifting really roughly, or maybe shifting from 10th to 1st, which somebody just said they had. That's not a problem. Everything still works. Your climate control, your drive mode, which selects between normal and tow haul and eco and sport, and then all the different modes where it puts it into 4-wheel drive, and you're in slippery mode, or you're in deep sand or mud, or what have you. We consider all those different modes to be unnecessary for the most part, and we just keep it in normal. Sometimes we put it into tow haul in our diesel, but in the PowerBoost, there's no reason to use tow haul. This interior is a much nicer interior than anything in any Chevy product we've ever used. We've driven that new Suburban, and it's just terrible. It's just an ergonomic disaster. Ford puts a tremendous amount of attention to detail into their interiors, and it just shows. Everything, all the switches, all the dials, everything is where you expect it to be, and it just works. All the switches on the steering wheel make perfect sense, and they're logical, and you don't have to waste a lot of time fiddling with them. The Suburban, for instance, it's got this stupid set of buttons here that you use to shift gears, and you push a button for park, and maybe you pull for neutral, or maybe you push for drive, but it won't let you shift into drive without putting on your seatbelt. And it's like, what if you just want to move it 5 feet down your driveway? You're not going anywhere, but it still makes you put the seatbelt on before it lets you shift into drive. And so the Ford doesn't have any of that ergonomic stupidity. The one thing it has that's the least bit unimpressive is this console shifter. It feels cheap. It feels like it's out of a Hyundai or something. And it's got the motorized thing where it folds down, so you got a flat surface here. And it just seems kind of gimmicky and tacky. The diesel F-150 that we've got, it's got a console shifter, and that console shifter shifts very smoothly, and it just works. And it's the way God meant for it to be. God did not mean for you to have a console shifter in your pickup truck. The ride in this truck is tremendously smooth, much smoother than in our 3-liter diesel, and it's almost the nicest ride of any pickup truck we've ever driven. Even with the 10-speed, even with the 20-inch rims, which we did not want, but you have to get them with the Max Tow package, and even with the 20-inch rims, it still has a very smooth and very forgiving ride. It's very well composed. It almost feels more like a luxury SUV, like an Expedition or something, than a real pickup truck with real load and trailer hauling capabilities. Very impressive ride in handling. But let's actually get out and take a look at those tires, because there's an issue with those tires that I want to show you. And Ford has decided to call this thing an all-terrain tire. And this is not an all-terrain tire by any stretch. It's an all-season tire. And you see that premature wear is starting to come in on the outer edge there. Same thing here. These ones are almost worn down to the belts. And you might say, well, 35,000 miles, that's all you should ever expect out of a set of tires. No, it isn't. We've gotten 50,000 miles out of a set of tires. Like on our Dodge 3500, our 2003 with the Cummins, tires on that thing will last for 2 years and 40 or 50,000 miles, and you will never see any wear on the inner or outer edges. Nothing. It just does not eat tires the way an F-150 does. Our 97 F-150 also ate tires. It demolished tires. And I don't know what it is about that front end. Obviously, it's an independent front end, so maybe it's got too much toe in, or maybe it's got, it wouldn't be negative camber. Maybe it's got positive camber or something. But for some reason, it devours tires. Other issues. The body itself is holding up just great. It doesn't have like a lot of dents and dings and scuffs and scrapes the way we'd expected an aluminum body would. The one thing I would say is the bed. You have to be exceptionally careful that you don't gouge the metal in the bed. Or you could just get a bed liner, which we have not yet. The factory tonneau cover, we'll show you one issue with it. So it's got like handles that you hook into the sides of the bed to lock it closed. And that will secure the back edge of the tonneau cover so people can't just flip it open. But those little handles, you fold them out of the way and then you flip the tonneau cover over a couple times. And even so, it still has a lot of gouging that it's done. Specifically right here, if you can see. It's just starting to gouge holes when you fold it over and then you fold it over again. We got one little scratch here. No big deal. Small issue with trailering. You got your 7-pin connector here, and you don't have a 4-pin. That's like the little hookup for the yaw sensor on the Pro Trailer backup, and that's the keyhole, so you can unlock the spare tire. And so when you go to use a trailer that doesn't have a 7-pin connector, it's got a 4-pin connector, you got to use the adapter every time, and it's just a little bit annoying. You'd think with a $60,000 pickup truck, they would they put your 4-pin connector on there and a 7-pin. Just like Dodge, just like a lot of other companies, but no, you got to use the adapter. It's fine. To be honest, we just don't have a lot of issues with this truck. The one issue it had early on, which was the fact that it did not want to keep a safe distance from the vehicles in front of it when you had the self-driving system engaged. Self-driving being lane centering and lane keeping combined. That seems to have resolved itself. That seems to have completely resolved itself. The other issue we had, which was the fact that the payload is so little. This thing only has a 1,484 pound payload, and that's not a lot. I mean, you can use up half the payload just with 4 passengers. And so that doesn't leave you a lot of tongue weight or pin weight. And so that limits severely the size of the trailer you can tow with this thing. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you shouldn't be towing a big trailer with an F-150 anyhow. But yes, if you had like a 10 or a 12,000 pound load in your I don't know, 20-foot gooseneck travel trailer, yeah, this thing could not handle it. And it's unfortunate. And you need to step up to the F-150 with the heavy-duty payload package if you're going to be doing heavy trailering. But that's only available with the 3.5 EcoBoost and the 5-liter V8. It is not available with this one. So that's really one of the few major weak spots of this truck. The fact that you're not going to be doing a lot of heavy towing with it. Specifically because you're going to be maxing out the rear axle. Other issues, really not much else to say. We've told you once or twice about the fact that when you've got that exact trailer, the 12-foot U-Haul hitched up, and you're going 70 miles an hour, that exact speed on the highway, and the U-Haul is fully loaded, the self-driving system starts to want to create trailer sway. Or I should say trailer sway starts to happen, and the self-driving system makes it worse because it overcorrects. And so before you know it, the trailer feels like it's about to get away from you, and you're about to wind up in the ditch, and you have to aggressively take over by doing all the steering yourself, because the self-driving system is basically doing this, and it's correcting, and it just keeps making it worse instead of making it better. And again, it's that exact trailer, a 12-foot U-Haul at exactly 70 miles an hour. If you're going 5 miles an hour faster or slower, that doesn't happen. But anyway, I think that's about it for now. Again, this truck represents a huge gamble, a technological leap on the part of Ford. They want to stay relevant. They know the world is changing. They know that they need to improve their gas mileage and the utility level of these trucks. The Lightning, they know the Lightning is not for everybody, because the Lightning has terrible range when you have a trailer hitched up. It's going maybe 80 miles and maybe 80 miles, and then you're stopping to charge for like an hour when you got a full trailer. And so they essentially they're treating this truck as like a half and half. The truck for people who want a little bit better gas mileage than the conventional engines give you, but you're not ready for an electric pickup truck because you actually drive this thing the way a truck was meant to be driven. You actually tow a trailer. You actually go 800 miles in a day. And so it's almost Ford's way of hedging their bets, knowing that the Lightning F-150 is going to satisfy a lot of customers, but not all their customers. And so they don't want to put all their eggs in that basket and then wind up pissing off people who actually use their trucks for real work. And so it's a very smart move on the part of Ford, because they don't want to wind up like Bethlehem Steel or so many other companies that refused or were unable to adjust to the times and ended up suffering the consequences. Again, great job by Ford with this truck. And at 34, almost 35,000 miles, we have virtually no issues to report. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great evening. Talk to you soon.